Bonjour à tous. C'est un plaisir pour moi d'avoir été invité à animer cet atelier sur la moralité ou la légalité. C'est une question que je trouve extrêmement intéressante, puis il ne faut pas vous tromper. Moi, je suis un fiscaliste, alors ce n'est pas quelque chose que je vois d'un point de vue philosophique. Mais je trouve quand même que c'est une question qui est extrêmement importante parce qu'à la base, chaque être humain doit se poser la question: est-ce que ces actions qu'il pose sont bien ou si elles sont mal? Et là, une fois qu'on a posé la question, est-ce qu'on doit se poser cette question-là en fiscalité? Évidemment, il y a toute la question de savoir si on doit trouver des critères pour établir ce qui est moral ou ce qui est fiscal. Alors moi, j'ai bien hâte d'entendre les conférenciers qui vont m'apprendre toutes sortes de choses là-dessus, parce que c'est un sujet que je trouve passionnant. Avant d'introduire les conférenciers, je voudrais remercier les gens qui ont organisé cette conférence. Je pense que ça prend beaucoup d'audace pour faire une conférence comme celle-là, et je pense que ça prend beaucoup de courage. Alors, je vais les nommer. Vous les connaissez tous, bien entendu, Brigitte Alpin. Il y a aussi Alison Christian, qui est à l'Université McGill. Il y a Lynn Latulippe, qui est à l'Université de Sherbrooke. Et il y a Nathalie Saint-Pierre, qui est à Richter. Et je pense que toutes les quatre doivent être chaleureusement remerciées parce que c'est un événement rare. Je vais d'abord présenter Brian Arnold et ensuite je vais présenter Mme Alison Holder. Je vais les présenter tous les deux tout de suite, comme ça je ne reviendrai pas, puis ils vont pouvoir se succéder au podium. Brian Arnold, pour ceux qui ne sont pas des fiscalistes, c'est quelqu'un qui est extrêmement connu dans le domaine de la fiscalité. C'est probablement un des fiscalistes parmi les plus réputés au Canada. Donc, c'est une chance qu'on l'ait aujourd'hui. C'est une personne qui a été diplômée de Harvard, qui a enseigné pendant une trentaine d'années dans une université canadienne. C'est une personne qui a agi comme consultant auprès de plusieurs gouvernements, qui a agi comme consultant auprès de l'OCDE, qui a agi comme consultant auprès des Nations unies. C'est quelqu'un qui a énormément d'expérience. C'est le coéditeur du prestigieux Bulletin for International Taxation. C'est évidemment un auteur prolifique. Donc, on a beaucoup de chance de l'avoir avec nous aujourd'hui. Et ça va vraiment valoir la peine d'écouter ce qu'il va nous dire au sujet de la moralité et de la légalité, qui reste toujours un sujet extrêmement difficile. Madame Alison Holder, on est chanceux de l'avoir. C'est une personne qui est venue de loin pour venir nous rencontrer, une personne qui est diplômée du London School of Economics. Si je veux faire attention, son titre, c'est Tax and Inequality Manager at Oxfam UK. Elle a publié sur les sujets de l'inégalité, de la fiscalité, des dépenses publiques. Elle a une quinzaine d'années d'expérience dans le domaine des non-governmental organizations et dans le secteur privé. Et son expérience dans le passé dans ces organisations-là va certainement nous donner un point de vue très différent de celui que moi, en tant que fiscaliste, je suis habitué à entendre parce qu'on voit par son background que c'est une personne qui est beaucoup plus proche des organismes non gouvernementaux et qui va certainement avoir une perspective particulière comme elle vient d'Oxfam. Alors, j'ai bien hâte de les entendre tous les deux. Monsieur Brian Arnold, si vous voulez venir.
I am here under false pretenses. I am not an expert on morality. I have enough difficulty dealing with tax laws. It will take a much bigger brain than mine to deal with the issue of morality and tax. And in that regard, I would recommend to you an excellent article by our chairman in the 2011 Canadian Tax Foundation annual report dealing with morality and taxation. I like to think that I'm a moral person, but that's my judgment, and I'm sure that your judgment about my morality might well be different than mine. I do not pay any more tax than the law requires me to pay. So what I'm going to do this afternoon in the short time that's available to me is I'd like to just say a few things about morality in tax, and they will boil down to the fact that, in my view, morality has nothing to do with this. I would like to talk a little bit about what the legal obligation to pay tax is, because I think that is where we should be focusing our attention. If you want multinational enterprises and wealthy individuals to pay more tax, right, the government has the means at their availability to make them do that. It's pretty simple. So I would like to just talk for a few minutes about that. In general, what the solutions are to this problem that we seem to have identified. I accept that there is a problem. There is a problem that multinationals can avoid tax. Wealthy individuals can avoid tax. I accept that's a problem and that we need to deal with it. If I have a moment at the end, I'd like to just tell you a little bit about what the United Nations is doing with respect to helping developing countries with respect to BEPS. So a lot to do in a little bit of time. So you can see here, my analysis is pretty simplistic. If there's a legal obligation to pay tax, the moral obligation to pay is irrelevant, right? Because there's a legal obligation. So the only sense of talking about moral obligations is where there's no legal obligation to pay, but somehow you think there's a moral obligation to pay. And in that situation, I think it's debatable whether or not the moral obligation controls. But even if there is, what does it mean? And if you think, for example, that there is a moral obligation to pay tax by these multinational companies or wealthy individuals where there's no legal obligation to pay, that's your judgment. And you must recognize that other people's judgment may well differ from yours. I mean, after all, we know now that tax advisors and taxpayers take very different views of what the legal obligation to pay tax is. So you can just imagine if we were to base this system on moral obligations to pay, what the difference in judgments would be. The second thing I want to say is that to talk about morality and corporations is totally meaningless. Corporations are pieces of paper, right? They're legal fictions. They don't exist. They don't pay tax. People pay tax, ultimately. Corporations are just these convenient vehicles that we can use to collect the tax that's actually payable by real people. We can talk about moral obligation of individuals, and I'm happy to talk about that. Now, maybe this is a pessimistic view of mine, but I would say to you, as far as I've been able to see in my years of experience dealing with this, taxpayers and their advisors are going to act in their personal self-interest. And we should simply accept that and deal with it. What do you expect them to do? Do you expect them to pay more tax than is legally owing? I mean, if you expect that, you are very naive. They're not going to do it. Do you expect Starbucks to voluntarily pay tax to the United Kingdom? They did, and you know why they did, right? It had nothing to do with moral obligation. It had to do with the fact that Starbucks was going to take a big hit to their revenues from sales of coffee in the UK. It was reputational risk. It had nothing to do with morality. And indeed, Starbucks paid £10 million, agreed to forego deductions equivalent to £10 million for 2 years. I mean, how do I know whether that's the right measure of tax that Starbucks should pay? Maybe they should be paying twice that. You can't base it on morality. So if we shift to the law tells us, the Duke of Westminster principle that Stephen referred to in the previous session, you can arrange your affairs to minimize the amount of tax payable. And that principle applies not only in Canada, it applies in most countries that I'm aware of. The competing principle is everyone should pay their fair share. Now, I like the idea of a system in which everyone pays their fair share. The difficulty is, who's going to determine what someone's fair share is? I can tell you, I would love a system in which I'm the one who decides what everyone's fair share is. But I don't like a system where one of you has that authority. So it's a legal standard. Here's where the problems come. The problems come where tax legislation is deficient, where the courts adopt a benign attitude to tax avoidance, and I can only say that the Supreme Court of Canada's approach to tax avoidance has been abysmal, in my opinion. They have basically caused tax avoidance in this country to flourish on the basis of the factors that you can see on the screen. And the other issue here is where taxpayers and their professional advisors are aggressive. And I could add there, I guess, that tax administration is deficient. When you have those 3 or 4 factors operating, you've got a serious problem. What are the solutions? Well, public naming and shaming may be a partial solution. I don't think it's a full solution. I think the general media coverage of tax issues is very poor and needs to be improved. The public is not well educated when it comes to tax matters. Criminal prosecutions for tax evasion are, generally speaking, not very effective because they're too costly, and you've got to remember that it's judges that are going to be making these decisions, and judges are very, very reluctant to send somebody to jail for something like, unless it's a very clear case of tax evasion. So the other solutions that I think are pretty clear here, we need tougher legislation. You simply need to alter the risk-reward analysis that taxpayers go through when they're trying to decide whether or not to engage in tax avoidance transactions. You could regulate the tax advisory profession, right? I don't think that will be a very effective solution, but it's something you could do. We need better courts. This little quote I've given you, where if courts simply construed the legislation purposefully and they viewed transactions realistically, I think we would go a long way to controlling tax avoidance. And we need better enforcement by the CRA and the Department of Justice. Now, you look at all those proposed solutions, and who's responsible for all of them? It's the government. It's the politicians, right? They're the ones who pass the legislation, or not, as the case might be. They're the ones that appoint the judges. They're the ones that provide the resources for the tax administration and the Department of Justice. So you can see, if you want to blame somebody, don't blame taxpayers, blame the governments. They're not acting to deal with this problem. And I'm not sure why they're not acting to deal with the problem, but they're not. Now, let me just say a few things about BEPS and multinationals. And I've often used a soccer metaphor to illustrate what I think the problem is in terms of international tax. I mean, all of you have seen 6- and 7-year-olds play soccer, right? The ball goes over here, and what do you see? You see this whole mob of little kids chase after the ball, right? And after a while, the ball pops out of the group, and it goes across, and they all chase after it. You've also seen professional soccer teams play, and it is very disciplined positional play. Well, international tax is a game of soccer between the professional soccer team, that's the multinational corporations, and the tax officials, those are the 6- and 7-year-old kids, right? And of course, the ball is the money. So the only time that those 6- and 7-year-olds get a chance to kick the ball is basically when the multinationals let them have a kick at it. Now, you may say that, well, BEPS is going to change all that. Right? I'm skeptical that that's going to happen, but I remain optimistic. Here are some of the solutions. I've just taken these solutions from the Oxfam report because it was convenient. And I'm just going to say just a couple of things about these. I mean, there's a reform process in which developing countries participate equally. The OECD has made a big deal about this. This is window dressing. Right? I mean, can you imagine tax officials from less developing countries, in other words, not the BRICS, but real developing countries, the poorer countries in the world, sitting around the table in Paris at the OECD talking about BEPS Action 2 on hybrids? I mean, if you've dealt with tax officials from developing countries, they simply do not have the expertise to participate equally with developed countries. What they need is they need technical assistance. They need training. They need capacity development. Country by country reporting, that's a good idea, right? It should be country by country and entity by entity reporting, which it isn't, but that may come. Make companies taxable based on their real economic activity. Well, I said that's a good idea. I just would like to know what's real economic activity. That has to do with what source rules are. So if you talk about, for example, services, I mean, most people think that the real economic activity with respect to services is the place where the services are performed. But I can tell you there are a bunch of countries in the world that think that no, it's the place where the services are used or consumed, where they're paid for. That's where the place of real economic activity is. Automatic exchange of information is a good idea. Taxes on wealth, I don't think they'll be very effective. Right? Stop the use of tax havens with a blacklist and sanctions, in my experience, just won't work. If you've studied CFC rules around the world, you'll know that a lot of countries used a blacklist, and inevitably, in every case, it failed miserably. So not generally a good idea. Worldwide formulary apportionment, often tossed around as a solution to transfer pricing. I'm no fan of arm's length transfer pricing, but worldwide formula apportionment will be a bad deal for developing countries. Transparency for tax incentives, a good idea. Now, just let me close by telling you a little bit about the activities of the United Nations. There is nobody here for the United Nations, so I feel I am a consultant to the United Nations on some of this stuff, so I just want to mention what they're doing. With respect to BEPS and developing countries, they have been very active. And you'll notice that one of the things that is not part of the OECD's BEPS agenda, and that is reevaluating the allocation of taxing rights between residence countries and source countries. And of course, that's the big issue as far as developing countries are concerned. So some of the things that the United Nations have done, in the last 2 years, they've produced 3 books. For example, this is the Capacity Development Unit of the Financing for Development offices at the United Nations. There's a book for developing countries on negotiating tax treaties. There's another one on administering and applying tax treaties. These are all available on the UN website. And there's a book that just came out recently which deals with protecting the tax base of developing countries and deals, for example, with a number of the BEPS items, but also deals with things that are not on the BEPS agenda, but developing countries are interested in them, and that is the taxation of services, and in particular technical services, tax incentives that were talked about earlier, and capital gains, which is an important issue for developing countries. The UN is also actively engaged in providing courses to developing countries. There have been courses in Panama and in Africa on transfer pricing and on tax treaties. And as well, the United Nations is involved in producing what the UN calls practical portfolios, the OECD calls toolkits, and these are documents that are intended to identify the risks of base erosion with respect to certain areas. The ones they're working on now are services and base eroding interest payments, and then identifying the solutions that developing countries might adopt in order to deal with these problems. Thank you very much, and I encourage all of you that consider yourselves to be moral taxpayers to add 10% to the tax that you calculate on your tax returns for next year.
Hi, I'm Alison Holder. I work with Oxfam in the UK, although I am originally Canadian from Toronto, so it's good to be home. And I'm the policy manager working on tax and inequality. And some of you, or hopefully many of you, will be familiar with the work of Oxfam Canada and Oxfam Quebec, and I have colleagues here, so kind of speaking on their behalf, really. You may have questions about why an organization like Oxfam is working on tax, and I hope that by the end of my presentation that will be much more clear. So we've been asked to speak today about tax and morality. And so my answer to the question, is tax a moral issue, is helpfully yes and no. I'd say there are moral considerations when it comes to taxation, and if you look at debates about following the letter of the law versus the spirit of the law, there's a certain amount of personal judgment that comes into that. But I would also say that the need to rely on moral judgment is actually a reflection of our broken tax system, and I think that that was along the lines of what Brian was referring to as well. And there's a sense that appealing to large corporations to be moral in matters of taxation, it reeks a little bit of desperation, where I think the voluntary payment by Starbucks of tax in the UK is a good example of that if we can't get the rules right, we feel powerless to change them, at least perhaps we can appeal to the morals of a corporation to get a few scraps of tax revenue back into the public purse. And that, to me, is a real reflection of the broken system. I think that the fact that we're framing tax as a moral issue is a sign that the norms are changing, but they're not changing quickly enough. And I think an example of that is the fact that I was at a dinner party, and somebody in casual conversation thought they would let me know that as a Canadian living in the UK, was I aware that there was a non-dom policy that meant that if I traveled out of the country a lot, could keep all of my income offshore. So I think two things I learned from that is, one, that there's a really long way to go if kind of tax avoidance schemes are being peddled at dinner parties. And two, that people should always do their homework, even in social occasions, because pitching a tax avoidance scheme to a tax justice campaigner is probably not a very good idea. And he had to spend the rest of the dinner listening to me pontificate and lobby him about tax issues. So two things I learned there. So I think in summary, is tax a moral issue? Trying to avoid paying your fair share of tax is immoral, but taxation is too important to be left to morals alone. And so I'm going to go on to a few other things that I think tax is beyond being just a moral issue. So tax for me is an issue of fairness and justice, and I think the general public understands this. So I don't have similar data for Canada, unfortunately, but in the United Kingdom, we did a survey this year, and 85% of British adults said that they find tax avoidance to be morally wrong, even if it is legal. And in the same survey, we asked the British public about UK companies avoiding tax in developing countries, and 78% said that they were concerned about that as well. So it's not just self-interested concern about the UK public revenue, they're also worried about developing countries. And I think, there's often complaints from experts that tax is oversimplified in the media, and I understand that, and I'm sure Oxfam is guilty of causing that problem sometimes. But I do think there's also a deliberate attempt at times to overcomplicate the issue. Whereas, if you don't know every single page of the tax code, you shouldn't be able to have a view about issues related to tax. And I think where tax is complex in many ways, it is also relatively simple. And it is a basic injustice that the richest people and the richest companies have access to tax haven networks using advisors and accountants and economists that ordinary people don't have the same access to. That's a basic injustice. And I think there's another basic injustice, which is that companies benefit from public goods. They benefit from roads, from ports, from having a healthy and educated workforce and consumers. And therefore they have an obligation to pay back into the public purse. So it is complex, but it is also relatively simple in some ways, and it is an issue of fairness and justice. I think tax is also a measure of societal effectiveness. And so when you look at a good tax system, it can generate sufficient revenue to sustain the institutions and activities of the state. And we know that a broad tax base is needed, so that includes contributions from individual citizens and companies to maintain healthy public finances. So I think these are kind of basic points, but it is a point that tax is a measure of how well a society is functioning. And we know also, especially from working in developing countries, research has shown that there are links between good tax systems and good governance, simplifying quite a lot there. But states that are over-reliant on other sources of income, like aid and like natural resource revenues, have less accountable and responsive governance. So I think just one quote that summarizes this point about tax as a measure of societal effectiveness is from Charles Adams. And he says, how people are taxed, who was taxed, and what was taxed tells you more about a society than anything else. So he says that tax habits could be to civilization what sex habits are to personality. They're basic clues to the way a society behaves. And I think that's an important point. Finally, tax is not only a moral issue, it's also a human rights issue. And tax is at the core of the social contract between citizens and the state, and between businesses and the state. And so abuse of the tax system, that undermines the social contract, and it robs government of the revenues they need to fulfill human rights obligations. And this is an emerging area of work. And I think if we look at tax justice, how it's recently being framed as a human rights issue, we take a look at Malawi and a recent report from ActionAid that showed Malawi, which is the poorest country in the world, lost out on $43 million US in revenue over the last 6 years from just one Australian mining company. And there's new research coming out next week that Oxfam's been a part of alongside the Tax Justice Network, the Global Alliance for Tax Justice, and Public Services International. And this is using a data set of US multinational companies, and it attempts to measure the gap between where US companies pay tax and where we judge them to really be doing business. And Brian mentioned that. In this case, it's based on a formula that mixes where they have employees, where they have assets, and where they have revenues. And this shows that in just 1 year, the tax gap for just US companies alone could have paid for the salaries of millions of nurses worldwide. Not 1 million or 2 million, but several million nurses. And that research will come out next Tuesday, so do look out for that. I want to talk a little bit about an issue that's really important for Oxfam, and that is very closely related to tax, and that's the issue of extreme economic inequality. I'm not sure you may be familiar with this statistic that Oxfam's put out, and that is that the 80 richest people own the same wealth as the 3.5 billion poorest people, and 80 is so few that they could fit on one single double-decker bus. And also, we said last year, or earlier this year, in fact, in January at Davos, that unless things change, the top 1% will be richer than the rest of the world combined by 2016. And unfortunately, even our own grim predictions have been surpassed because that benchmark was met a couple of weeks ago, so it didn't even take us till 2016. So things are not getting better, but in fact, even worse than we thought. People seem to inherently agree with the idea that inequality is bad for everybody. So some of the statistics around this, economic inequality is associated with a range of health and social problems, like mental illness and violent crime. Homicide rates are almost 4 times higher in countries with extreme economic inequality than in more equal nations. And just an example from Latin America, which is the most unequal and insecure region in the world. It has 41 of the world's 50 most dangerous cities, and it saw 1 million murders take place between 2000 and 2010. Oh, that's slow. Oh, there we go. Hang on, sorry. Fancy PowerPoint effects. So why is Oxfam focusing on inequality now? And I think we feel like the tides are turning. So there's an increasing consensus among global leaders and across the political spectrum of the need to tackle inequality. And here's some quotes from Obama and from Christine Lagarde of the IMF, from Pope Francis, and from Warren Buffett, who says, there's been class warfare going on for the last 20 years, and my class has won. So there's a real broadening consensus that economic inequality is a problem. So then let's look at the links between inequality and tax. If there is a broad agreement that extreme inequality is immoral, is unfair and unjust, is ineffective, i.e. it's not good for anybody, and is a breach of human rights, then given the very strong links between tax and inequality, so that is, just as some examples, we know that when the tax system is unfair, inequality rises, and one of the ways in which that happens is if corporations are paying less tax, corporate profits increase, and those profits accrue overwhelmingly to the richest sections of society. So we know in the US, for example, about 50% of corporate income is held by the richest 1% of society. So those links between the inequality and the tax system are very tight. We also know that tax revenues are needed to tackle the problem of inequality, so investing in public services that disproportionately benefit the poor. And we also know that the tax system is a key tool for redistributing wealth. So if we believe all of these things about inequality, then we should believe the same about a broken tax system. And therefore, fixing our tax system is necessary for morality, for justice, for effectiveness, and for the realization of human rights. I want to say a little bit about tax as a corporate responsibility issue. And this is just, it should be clear that the majority of Oxfam's work is focused on developing countries where millions of people, men and women, live in extreme poverty, and on the ground we see every day how important tax revenues are for governments to fund essential public services and to pay for public infrastructure. So tax is too important to be left entirely to corporate responsibility, but I do think that there are meaningful and immediate steps that responsible companies can take to improve the impact of their tax behavior on society. So I did want to say just a couple of words about that. The idea of tax as a corporate responsibility issue is not new. There's a growing movement to have tax seen as a core part of the CSR agenda. And we have Richard Murphy here today, and he's been promoting the Fair Tax Mark, one of the founders of the Fair Tax Mark. And this is, at the moment, I believe, mostly just for UK companies, but it is expanding. And the fact that companies are interested in this, trying to sign up, and trying to meet the very rigorous criteria in order to be awarded Fair Tax Mark status shows that they really see the value in this. And also the UN Global Compact, there's a growing recognition that the principles that the Global Compact espouses about corporate responsibility should include an 11th principle about paying fair tax, and that's perhaps the most important corporate responsibility obligation. So there is certainly a growing movement around this. And just to say quickly that Oxfam, alongside ActionAid and ChristianAid, are about to put out a new report which is called Getting to Good Towards Responsible Corporate Tax Behavior. And this is really building on the idea that, as with many issues of corporate responsibility, it's not just about regulation, but also about values that must shape tax behavior. And so this report is about responsibility beyond legal compliance. It goes into 8 areas of the corporate tax agenda, and this report will be coming out at the end of this month, so do look out for that. But kind of getting back to the areas that are more the bread and butter or the core of what Oxfam works on in terms of global tax reform, and that's really pushing governments to change the rules and to enforce the rules in order to crack down on tax evasion and tax avoidance. I think the diagnosis of the problems with the current tax system are very largely shared. And so, quite simply, the current international tax system is broken. It was designed 100 years ago. It's not fit for purpose, and it works in the interest of richer countries, disadvantaging developing countries. Pretty simply, we've heard a lot about this today. Multinational companies, many of them, are not paying their fair share of tax in the countries where they really do business. And tax evasion and tax avoidance is fueling inequality because it contributes to a trickle up of income and wealth. So this is all, I think, very widely shared. And this is partly why the G20 and the OECD instigated the BEPS process. And that process has gone some way to filling the gaps in the current system. And I've heard Pascal, who was with us by video this morning, talk about himself as a firefighter, kind of trying to really just fight the fires and plug the very glaring gaps in the current system. But for Oxfam, that's not enough. And we'd like to see the debate about more wholesale reform of the corporate tax system be much more prominent. And I think there remains a real divide between civil society organizations working on tax justice and many of the world's most powerful governments and companies and institutions like the OECD on what needs to be done to fix the tax system. One fresh, I think, new voice in the debate that you may not be aware of is a new commission called Inequality. And this commission has several prominent commissioners, including Jose Antonio Ocampo, the former finance minister of Colombia, and Professor Joseph Stiglitz, the Nobel Prize-winning economist. This year in June, Inequality published a declaration where they talked about their vision for the future of the international tax system, what a fairer tax system would look like. It's a very short and readable report. If you haven't seen it, I would encourage you to look it up. They talk about 6 areas of reform. They say, quite simply, multinationals should be taxed as single firms. They talk about steps that need to be taken to curb tax competition, so exactly what we're here today to talk about. They talk about strengthening enforcement, increasing transparency, reforming tax treaties, and building inclusivity into the international tax system, that should say. So for Oxfam, beyond BEPS, where do we go from here? What is this more holistic tax reform agenda? And we did welcome BEPS. We've been quite closely engaged with it. But I think it was kind of a sobering reminder of how difficult international tax cooperation is. And we had 2 real main critiques of that process. The first is that 2/3 of the world's countries did not have an equal seat at the table and played no formal role. And the second, that the agenda was too narrow, and Brian alluded to that in his talk as well. So what we would like to see now is a second generation of tax reforms, and it's really, I think, a good time to be thinking about this because the G20 leaders are about to go to Turkey for the G20 summit. And we would like to see this second generation of tax reforms include, first of all, a more inclusive governance structure, getting the right countries around the table from the beginning, and include a more holistic agenda. So some of the things, again, Brian talked about, so ending tax competition, reallocating taxing rights, addressing capital gains tax, and taxing companies as single entities. So these are all the kinds of issues that we think need to be part of a Beyond BEPS agenda, and we hope that the door won't be closed on those broader debates. And ultimately, we really see the need for a global tax body, an institution where all countries have an equal seat at the table to agree on global tax rules. And that's something that we, alongside developing countries, were calling for very prominently at a UN summit in Ethiopia this summer. So in conclusion, tax is a moral issue, in my view, but it is much more. Our current tax system is not only immoral, but it's unjust, it's ineffective, and it's in violation of human rights. So tax, for me, is also a corporate responsibility issue, and as I said, there are meaningful and immediate steps that companies can take to improve the impact of its tax behavior. But fixing the problems in our tax system require greatly improved government action, and that means improved international cooperation on tax, more ambitious government-led reforms at home and abroad, and binding rules, and ultimately for us, a fully inclusive and democratic global tax body. Thanks very much.